The snow had been falling for 3 days straight when Private First Class Daniel Joseph Carver realized he was probably going to die in these woods. It was January 17th, 1945, somewhere in the Ardennes Forest near the Belgian village of Foy. The temperature hovered around 14 degrees. His breath came out in shallow clouds that he had to time carefully, watching them dissipate before exhaling again. Any sustained vapor could give away his position. He'd been in the same depression behind a fallen oak for 41 hours now. His right shoulder, shattered by shrapnel 6 weeks earlier at Bastogne, had gone from burning pain to a dull throb that never stopped. The battalion surgeon had cleared him for light duty, but there was nothing light about what he was doing now. The German convoy had rolled into Foy 2 days ago, 12 vehicles, maybe 60 men, setting up a forward observation post in what remained of the village church. Intelligence said a high-value target was among them, a Wehrmacht officer coordinating artillery strikes that had pinned down 2 companies of the 101st Airborne for the better part of a week. Captain Morrison had been direct about it during the briefing in the frozen cellar they were using as a command post. "We need him gone, Carver. You're the only scope we've got left." The M1903A4 Springfield lying beside him in the snow.
I really hate to interrupt the story right when it's getting emotional, but I desperately need your help to reach the goal of 1,000 subscribers. If what you've heard so far has moved you, please take just 2 seconds to hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to this channel. Help me bring more stories like this to life. Thank you, and now let's continue.
Was one of 3 sniper rifles their entire battalion still had operational. The glass on the Weaver 330C scope was cracked in the lower right corner from the same explosion that had torn up his shoulder, but it still held 0 at 400 yards. He'd checked it yesterday on a German helmet some poor bastard had left on a fence post. The village sat in a shallow bowl 280 yards downslope from his hide. Through the scope's narrow field of view, he could see the church's damaged steeple, the burned-out half-tracks in the square, the steam rising from a field kitchen the Germans had set up near the town well. They were careful, disciplined. They moved in pairs, never exposed for more than a few seconds, always with cover between positions. The officer hadn't shown himself yet, if he existed at all. Carver had begun to wonder if the intelligence was wrong, if some French partisan had fed them bad information just to feel useful, to be part of something. It happened more than people wanted to admit. His hands had stopped shaking around the 30-hour mark. Before that, the cold and the lingering nerve damage from his shoulder wound made it nearly impossible to hold steady. He'd practiced the breathing, the way his father taught him when he was 12, hunting deer in the timber country outside Marquette, Michigan. His father had been a finishing carpenter who could drive a 16-penny nail in 3 strokes and quote entire chapters of Matthew from memory. He'd taught Daniel that patience was a form of prayer, that waiting was how you proved you were serious about what you wanted. Daniel hadn't thought about his father in months. Now lying in frozen earth that smelled like cordite and pine rot, he couldn't stop. If you want to know whether this shot was worth 48 hours in the snow, whether the man Daniel Carver was waiting for ever appeared, and what it cost him when the moment finally came, you'll need to stay with this until the end. Because what happened in those woods outside Foy wasn't about marksmanship. It was about what a man can endure when everything he believes is tested in the space of a single trigger pull. The Springfield held 5 rounds in the magazine. Daniel had loaded it with 4, 1 in the chamber, 3 in reserve. The 30-06 cartridges were standard M2 ball ammunition, boat tail, 150 grains. In this cold, the round would fly a fraction faster than normal, maybe 2,800 feet per second at the muzzle. At 280 yards, he'd need to hold just under the target's chin to hit center mass on the torso. The wind was the problem. It had been gusting from the northwest since dawn, 8 to 12 miles per hour, swirling unpredictably through the trees and across the open ground between his position and the village. A 10-mile-per-hour crosswind at this distance meant roughly 4 inches of drift. But 4 inches was the difference between a killing shot and a wound that would make noise, draw return fire, and accomplish nothing except getting him killed for no reason. He'd made his hide carefully, After Captain Morrison gave him the mission, Daniel had moved into position just after midnight on the 15th, carrying only the rifle, 20 rounds of ammunition, 2 canteens, and a wool blanket rolled tight across his back. He wore every layer he owned: long underwear, wool trousers, a flannel shirt, a field jacket, and a white camouflage smock that had belonged to another sniper, a corporal from Pennsylvania who'd taken a round through the neck outside Bastogne on Christmas Eve. The man's name had been Kowalski. They'd never spoken more than a few words. Now Daniel was wearing his gear, using techniques Kowalski had probably learned the same hard way. The depression behind the oak was natural, a shallow trough where water runoff had carved out the earth over decades. Daniel had packed snow along the forward edge to create a low parapet, shaping it carefully so the contour looked random, like everything else in this frozen forest. He didn't pile it high. Height drew eyes. Instead, he created depth, nestling himself down into the hole so that only his head and the rifle's barrel would break the surface when he needed to observe. He'd placed broken branches across the position, weaving them into the surrounding undergrowth so the geometry didn't stand out. From 50 feet away, it looked like a dead tree and some wind-blown debris. That was the idea. Camouflage wasn't about becoming invisible, it was about becoming uninteresting. The human eye noticed patterns, edges, movement. Daniel had learned to eliminate all three. His movements were glacial, shifting position only when the wind moved the branches around him, creating natural motion to mask his own. He didn't look directly at the village except through the scope, because the white oval of a face could catch light in a way that triggered something primal in an observer's brain. When he needed to scan without the scope, he kept his face angled down, watching through the narrow gap between his helmet's rim and the snow parapet, letting his peripheral vision do the work. The cold was its own kind of enemy. After the first 12 hours, his feet had gone numb despite the 2 pairs of wool socks. He'd learned in training that you could lose toes to frostbite before you even realized it was happening. Every few hours he forced himself to flex his toes inside his boots, feeling for that pins and needles sensation that meant blood was still moving. His fingers were worse. He kept his shooting hand inside his jacket, except when he needed to check the rifle, and even then he moved slowly, deliberately, never exposing skin to the air for more than a few seconds at a time. Staying quiet was harder than staying still. Sound, carried differently in cold air, traveled farther, sharper. He'd learned to control his breathing so it didn't rasp in his throat, to swallow without gulping, to ignore the pressure in his bladder until it became unbearable, and then relieve himself without moving anything except his hips, letting the warmth soak into his trousers and then freeze there against his skin. It was humiliating in a
I really hate to interrupt the story right when it's getting emotional, but I desperately need your help to reach the goal of 1,000 subscribers. If what you've heard so far has moved you, please take just 2 seconds to hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to this channel. Help me bring more stories like this to life. Thank you, and now let's continue.
way that would have mattered before the war. Now it was just technique, just another thing you did to stay alive and complete the mission. The Germans in Foy moved through their routines with a kind of tired efficiency that Daniel recognized. They were cold too, hungry too, far from home, and wondering if any of this made sense anymore. He watched them through the scope during the daylight hours, studying their patterns. The field kitchen operated on a schedule, hot food twice a day, once at dawn and once at dusk. The men rotated guard duty in 4-hour shifts. 2 men on the church tower, 4 more in foxholes at the village perimeter. They smoked when they thought they were safe, cupping cigarettes in their palms the same way American soldiers did. At night, they gathered near the fires and Daniel could hear fragments of their voices carried on the wind. German words he didn't understand, but that sounded like complaints, like exhaustion, like men who wanted to be anywhere but here. On the second morning, January 16th, Daniel saw the officer for the first time. The man emerged from the church just after sunrise, a tall figure in a grey-green greatcoat and peaked cap, moving with the careful posture of someone aware of sniper threat. He didn't linger in the open. 3 steps from the church door to a covered walkway, another 5 to a sandbagged position near the town well. Daniel tracked him through the scope, finger resting along the Springfield's trigger guard, not on the trigger itself. Not yet. The range was good, 275 yards, almost ideal. But the wind was wrong, gusting hard from the left, and the officer's exposure lasted maybe 4 seconds. Daniel watched him disappear behind the sandbags and knew he'd have to wait. His shoulder was screaming by then. The shrapnel had torn through the deltoid and nicked something deeper, maybe a nerve cluster, because his whole arm would go electric with pain at random intervals. The battalion surgeon, a captain from North Carolina with hands that smelled like iodine, had pulled out 3 pieces of metal and told Daniel he was lucky it hadn't severed the brachial artery. "You'll have weakness," the surgeon said. "Probably permanent. Don't try to lift anything heavy for a while." A sniper rifle weighed just under 9 pounds. The scope added another pound. Holding it steady for hours at a time wasn't lifting heavy exactly, but it wasn't what the surgeon had in mind either. Daniel used a trick Kowalski had shown him during a training exercise near the Belgian border. He'd pack snow under the rifle's forestock, creating a solid rest that took the weight off his arms. It worked, mostly. The position was stable enough for an accurate shot. But his shoulder still burned, still sent those electric jolts down to his fingertips at the worst moments. He'd learned to breathe through it, to separate the pain from the task, to focus on the reticle and the wind and the target's movement. The officer appeared again late that afternoon. Same routine, same careful movement from the church to the command post. This time Daniel was ready. Wind had dropped to 5 miles per hour, almost due west. He could hold for it, maybe 2 inches left of center. The officer paused near the well, speaking to a sergeant who'd come out of one of the damaged houses. They stood there for 10 seconds. 12. 15. Daniel's breathing slowed. His finger moved from the trigger guard to the trigger itself, feeling the Springfield's familiar resistance, the slack before the break. The officer turned slightly, presenting his left side, perfect angle for a heart-lung shot. Daniel began to apply pressure. Then a child ran into the square. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, dark hair flying behind her, wearing a coat several sizes too large. She ran straight toward the well, either not seeing the Germans or not caring. The officer turned, shouted something. The sergeant raised his rifle, not aiming, just a reflexive movement. The girl stopped, frozen in the middle of the square. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Daniel kept the scope on the officer's chest, finger still on the trigger, pressure still building. The crosshairs were steady. The wind was right. It was a perfect shot. All he had to do was press another 1/4 inch. The officer lowered his hand, gestured for the sergeant to stand down. He walked toward the girl, slowly, carefully, the way you'd approach a wounded animal. Daniel watched through the scope as the man knelt in the snow, speaking quietly, until the girl finally turned and ran back toward the houses. The officer stood, brushed snow from his knees, and walked back to the command post. The window closed. Daniel eased his finger off the trigger and let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. That night, the temperature dropped to 9 degrees. Daniel lay in his hide and tried not to think about the shot he hadn't taken. Captain Morrison's orders had been clear: high-value target, eliminate on sight. No one had mentioned children running through the line of fire. No one had mentioned what you were supposed to do when the enemy stopped being a target and became a man who just saved a little girl's life. His father's voice came back to him then, something from Matthew. "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." Daniel had memorized that verse for Sunday school when he was 7, reciting it in front of the congregation while his father watched from the front pew. He'd understood the words, but not their weight. Now, lying in frozen earth with a rifle beside him and blood on his hands from wounds already inflicted, he understood perfectly. Mercy was easy when it cost you nothing. Real mercy was what happened when it cost you everything and you chose it anyway. But this wasn't mercy. This was hesitation. This was weakness that could get other men killed. The officer in that village was coordinating artillery strikes that had already killed Americans. How many more would die if Daniel didn't take the shot? How many families would get telegrams because he'd flinched at the critical moment? His father had taught him patience, but the army had taught him something else. That killing was sometimes the only moral choice available, that inaction could be worse than action, that a good man did hard things because someone had to. Daniel closed his eyes and tried to pray. The words wouldn't come. He'd been able to pray in Bastogne, even under artillery fire, even when pieces of men he'd eaten breakfast with were scattered across frozen ground. But here, alone in the dark with only his breathing and the distant sound of German voices, prayer felt like asking permission for something he'd already decided to do. God didn't answer questions like that. God gave you a conscience and the freedom to ignore it. The rest was on you. By dawn on the 17th, Daniel had been in position for 41 hours. His body had started to shut down in small ways. His fingers wouldn't fully straighten anymore. His jaw ached from clenching it to keep his teeth from chattering. The damaged nerves in his shoulder sent constant sparks of pain that he'd stopped trying to suppress. He just let them happen, accepted them as part of the landscape, like the cold and the hunger and the growing certainty that even if he made the shot, he might not make it back to friendly lines. The officer came out of the church at 08:15. Daniel saw him through the scope, same greatcoat, same careful movements. But this time the man didn't head for the command post. He walked toward the southern edge of the village, where a damaged half-track sat tilted into a shell crater. He stood there for a long moment, looking south toward where American lines were dug in. Maybe he was thinking about artillery coordinates. Maybe he was just tired of being inside. Daniel settled the crosshairs on the man's chest. Wind was calm, maybe 3 miles per hour from the west, temperature stable, range 260 yards. Every variable was as good as it was going to get. His breathing slowed to almost nothing. His finger found the trigger, took up the slack. The officer shifted his weight, turned slightly, presenting a cleaner angle. The moment had come. All Daniel had to do was press, but his hand wouldn't move. Something fundamental had broken in the machinery of his will. He could see the shot, knew exactly how to make it, understood intellectually that this was why he was here. But the image of that officer kneeling in the snow beside the frightened child had lodged itself somewhere deeper than training or orders or duty. Daniel had killed men before. He would probably kill men again. But he couldn't kill this one. Not like this. Not after what he'd seen. He eased off the trigger and lowered the rifle. The officer walked back toward the church and disappeared inside. Daniel lay in his hide and stared at nothing, feeling something close to relief mixed with shame. He'd failed. The mission was blown. Men would die because of his weakness, but at least he wouldn't have to carry the weight of this particular death. Then the artillery started. The first rounds hit the American positions at 0840. Heavy stuff, probably 105 millimeters or larger. Daniel could hear the impacts even at this distance, feel the concussion waves rolling through the frozen earth. The barrage lasted 6 minutes. When it stopped, the German infantry moved out from Foy, pushing toward where the American lines were weakest. Daniel watched them go, watched the officer directing traffic from the church steps, and understood with perfect clarity what his hesitation had cost. He had 4 rounds left in the Springfield. The officer was exposed again, same position, same range. Daniel brought the scope up one more time. The crosshairs found their mark. His finger went back to the trigger. This time there was no child, no interruption, no excuse. Just the target and the rifle, and the choice that would define what kind of man Daniel Joseph Carver was going to be when this war finally ended. If it ever did. The barrage had stopped, but Daniel could still hear the screams. American voices, distant and raw, carrying across the frozen valley from positions he couldn't see. The officer stood on the church steps with a radio handset pressed to his ear, speaking calmly while men died because of the coordinates he was calling in. Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger. The crosshairs held steady on the man's chest. 3 pounds of pressure. That's all it would take. 3 pounds and this would be over. But his hand still wouldn't complete the movement. Something had fractured inside him during those 48 hours in the snow, some mechanism that allowed men to do terrible things and call them necessary. He'd crossed that line before, at Bastogne, and a dozen nameless fields between Normandy and here. He'd killed men who were probably decent, who probably had families, who were just following orders same as him. But he'd never hesitated before. He'd never seen the humanity clearly enough for it to matter. The officer lowered the radio and turned back toward the church. The window was closing again. Daniel forced himself to breathe, forced himself to remember Captain Morrison's face in that frozen cellar, the weight of those words. "You're the only scope we've got left." How many men had died in the last 6 minutes because Daniel couldn't pull a trigger? How many more would die in the next hour, the next day, because one German officer kept breathing? His father's voice came back, a different verse this time. "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." But this wasn't about laying down his own life. This was about taking...
I really hate to interrupt the story right when it's getting emotional, but I desperately need your help to reach the goal of 1,000 subscribers. If what you've heard so far has moved you, please take just 2 seconds to hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to this channel. Help me bring more stories like this to life. Thank you, and now let's continue.
Someone else's. That was the twisted arithmetic of war, where love meant killing, where protecting your brothers required becoming the kind of man your father never wanted you to be. Daniel's shoulders screamed as he adjusted his position slightly, getting a better angle. The officer had paused in the church doorway, speaking to the sergeant from yesterday. They stood there in profile, 2 men having a conversation about things that probably seemed important to them. Ammunition supplies, maybe. Rotation schedules, whether the coffee was any good. Human things. The crosshairs drifted between them, and Daniel realized he was crying. Silent tears that froze on his cheeks before they could fall. He thought about the child again. The way she'd run into that square with no awareness of danger, no understanding that men with rifles were waiting to destroy each other. The officer could have let the sergeant shoot her, could have ignored her entirely. Instead, he'd walked out into the open, made himself a target to calm a frightened girl he'd never seen before. What kind of man did that? And what kind of man killed him for it? The officer stepped inside the church. The sergeant followed. The door closed. Daniel lowered the rifle and pressed his forehead against the frozen earth. He'd failed again. The mission was over. He needed to extract, get back to American lines, report that the target couldn't be acquired. Morrison would understand. Or he wouldn't. Either way, Daniel was done. He couldn't stay here anymore. His body was shutting down, his mind fragmenting. Another 12 hours and he'd be too weak to move, would just freeze to death in this hole while the war continued without him. He began the slow process of preparing to withdraw, moving in tiny increments to avoid drawing attention. He'd wait until dark, then low crawl back through the forest to where a 2-man patrol was supposed to extract him. If they were still there, if they hadn't been killed in the barrage, if any of this still mattered. Then he heard the vehicles. 3 trucks rolled into Foy from the east, canvas covered, moving slowly on the icy roads. They stopped in the village square, and German soldiers began unloading crates. Ammunition, probably. Maybe food. The field kitchen crew moved out to help. Within minutes, the square was full of men, more than Daniel had seen at any one time since he'd been watching. 20, maybe 25. All moving with the relaxed posture of men who thought they were safe, who believed the front line was far enough away that they could afford to let their guard down for a few minutes. The church door opened. The officer emerged, flanked by 2 others in similar greatcoats. They walked toward the trucks, moving through the crowd of soldiers. Daniel brought the scope up instinctively, tracking the officer's movement. The man stopped beside the lead truck, examining papers one of the drivers handed him. He stood there completely exposed, stationary, at 270 yards. Perfect shot, perfect conditions, perfect opportunity. Daniel's breathing had stopped completely. The crosshairs rested on the officer's chest, rising and falling microscopically with the rhythm of the man's breathing. Around him, German soldiers laughed about something, sharing cigarettes, looking forward to hot food and a few hours of relative safety. Normal men doing normal things in the middle of something fundamentally abnormal. If Daniel pulled the trigger now, he'd kill more than just the officer. The sound would shatter that moment of peace, would send all those men scrambling for weapons and cover, would turn the square into chaos. Some of them might die in the confusion. Some of them might survive. But all of them would carry that moment for the rest of their lives. Would remember the day a bullet came from nowhere and reminded them that there was no such thing as safety, no place where the war couldn't reach them. His father had taught him that every action rippled outward, that you couldn't do harm in isolation even when you thought you could. Violence begets violence, he'd said once, after Daniel got in a fight at school. You think you're settling a score, but you're just creating the next one. Daniel had thought that was naive back then, the kind of thing religious people said because they didn't understand how the real world worked. Now, with his finger on the trigger and death measured in pounds of pressure, he understood perfectly. But understanding didn't make the choice any easier. American soldiers were dying right now, this moment, because that officer kept calling in coordinates. More would die tonight, tomorrow, next week. The war would continue with all its machinery of suffering, and Daniel's refusal to act would be part of that machinery. There was no clean choice here, no path that didn't lead through blood and regret, just degrees of terrible, measured in lives he could save versus lives he would take. The officer folded the papers and handed them back to the driver. He said something that made the nearby soldiers laugh. Then he turned and started walking back toward the church. The crowd began to disperse, men picking up crates and moving toward storage areas. The moment was passing. In 10 seconds, the officer would be back inside. In 20 seconds, it would be too late. Daniel's finger completed the movement. The Springfield kicked against his damaged shoulder, sending a nova of pain through his entire right side. The sound was enormous in the frozen silence, a crack that rolled across the valley like thunder. Through the scope, Daniel saw the officer stumble, saw the spray of red against white snow, saw the man go down hard and not move. Then everything became chaos. The German soldiers scattered, some throwing themselves flat, others running for cover. Rifle fire erupted from multiple positions, poorly aimed shots that tore through empty forest. Daniel didn't move. He lay perfectly still, watching through the scope as men surrounded the officer's body, as someone knelt beside him and then stood up shaking his head. He watched as they organized themselves, as discipline overcame panic, as they began methodically sweeping the tree line with rifle fire and machine guns. Rounds snapped through the branches above Daniel's position. Bark exploded from the oak tree that had sheltered him for 48 hours. He pressed himself deeper into the depression, making himself as small as possible, and waited for the bullet that would find him. It didn't come. The Germans were firing blind, hoping volume would compensate for accuracy. After 5 minutes, the firing slowed. After 10, it stopped. Daniel knew he should move, should use the confusion to extract before they organized a proper search. But his body wouldn't respond. The recoil had done something to his shoulder, torn something that had been barely holding together. His entire right arm was useless now, hanging limp at his side. He couldn't carry the rifle, could barely move at all. He lay in the hole and watched his breath cloud in the cold air and wondered if this was where he'd die after all. The German search parties moved out from the village around noon. 3 groups of 4 men each, moving carefully through the forest in a standard sweep pattern. They'd find him eventually. It was just a matter of time. Daniel pulled his sidearm with his left hand, a Colt 1911 that felt awkward and heavy in his offhand. 7 rounds. Not enough to fight his way out, but enough to choose his own ending if it came to that. He thought about his father's workshop in Marquette, the smell of sawdust and linseed oil, the way late afternoon light would slant through the windows and make the wood grain glow. He thought about Sunday mornings in that small church, his father's voice leading the congregation through hymns that Daniel had found boring as a child but would give anything to hear now. He thought about all the choices that had led him to this frozen hole in Belgium, about the thousands of small decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time, but had added up to something he barely recognized. The first German patrol passed within 30 yards of his position. They moved slowly, professionally, checking likely hide sites. Daniel held perfectly still. The 1911 pointed at the nearest man, knowing that if they found him, he'd have maybe 1 second to decide whether to fight or surrender. The soldiers moved on. The second patrol went south, away from his position. The third never materialized. Either they'd been called back, or they'd decided the sniper was long gone. By dusk, the village had gone quiet again. Daniel waited another hour to be sure, then began the agonizing process of extracting himself from the hide. His right arm was completely dead weight. He left the Springfield behind, covering it with snow. Someone would find it eventually, but it wouldn't matter. He kept only the sidearm and 1 canteen, everything else abandoned to save weight and increase mobility. The crawl back to American lines took 4 hours. Daniel moved on his stomach, pulling himself forward with his left arm, using his legs to push. Every few minutes he'd stop, listen, make sure no one was following. The forest was full of sounds that could have been Germans or could have been wind. He couldn't tell anymore. His mind was starting to fragment, hypothermia setting in, the cold finally winning the battle it had been fighting for 2 days. He made it to within 50 yards of friendly positions before he passed out. The next thing he remembered was waking up in an aid station, wrapped in blankets, a medic checking his vitals. Captain Morrison was there too, standing by the cot with an expression Daniel couldn't read. "You got him," Morrison said quietly. "The officer. German radio traffic confirms it. Artillery strikes stopped an hour after you took the shot. You saved a lot of lives today, Carver." Daniel closed his eyes. Saved lives. That was one way to look at it. The other way was that he'd killed a man who'd shown mercy to a child, who'd probably had a family waiting for him somewhere, who'd been trying to survive this war same as everyone else. Both things were true. That was the part they didn't tell you in training. That you could be a hero and a murderer at the same time. That the same act could be both right and wrong, depending on which angle you viewed it from. "You did good," Morrison continued. "I'm putting you in for a Bronze Star. You earned it." Daniel didn't respond. What could he say? That he'd hesitated? That he'd almost let the target walk because he'd seen something human in the enemy? That the shot that saved American lives had cost him something he couldn't name, but that he knew he'd never get back? Morrison wouldn't understand. Nobody would. They'd see the results and call it courage. They'd never know about the 48 hours of doubt, the internal war that was harder than anything happening on the battlefield. The medic said he'd lose function in his right arm. The damage was too extensive, too many structures torn beyond repair. He'd go home eventually, back to Michigan, back to his father's workshop where maybe he could learn to do one-handed what he used to do with 2. He'd go to church on Sundays and sing the hymns and listen to sermons about righteousness and mercy, and try not to think about snow and silence and the moment when he chose duty over conscience. 3 weeks later, they shipped him to a hospital in England. 6 weeks after that, he was on a transport back to the States. The war in Europe ended in May. Daniel listened to the celebrations from a rehabilitation center in Virginia, surrounded by men who'd given pieces of themselves to the war machine and who were trying to figure out how to be human again. Some of them succeeded. Some of them didn't. Daniel wasn't sure which category he'd fall into. He made it back to Marquette in June of 1945. His father met him at the train station, older and grayer than Daniel remembered. They drove home in silence, past forests that looked nothing like Belgium, but that Daniel couldn't look at without flinching. That night, sitting at the dinner table in a house that felt both familiar and impossibly foreign, his father asked him directly, "Did you do what you had to do?" Daniel thought about lying, thought about telling the easy version where he was a hero who saved his brothers in arms. But his father's eyes were too knowing, had seen too much of life to be fooled by simple stories. So Daniel told him the truth. All of it. The waiting, the cold, the officer and the child, the hesitation, the final shot. When he finished, his father was quiet for a long time. "The Lord doesn't ask us to be perfect," he said finally. "He asks us to be faithful. Sometimes that means doing hard things. Sometimes it means living with hard things we've done. The weight doesn't go away. You just get stronger at carrying it. Daniel wanted to believe that. Wanted to think that time would dull the edges, that eventually he'd be able to remember Foy without feeling like he was back in that frozen hole with death measured in pounds of trigger pressure. But he knew better. Some things marked you too deeply to ever fully heal. You just learned to live with the scars. The Bronze Star arrived in the mail 3 months later. Daniel put it in a drawer and never looked at it again. He went back to work in his father's shop, learning to cut lumber one-handed, to measure twice and cut once, to take pride in small things done well. He went to church on Sundays and sang the hymns and tried to mean the words about forgiveness and grace. Some days were easier than others. He never talked about the war except once, years later, to his own son, who was thinking about enlisting. They were in the workshop, late afternoon light slanting through the windows, same as it had when Daniel was young. His son asked him what it was like. The war, the killing. Daniel thought about giving him the sanitized version, the one where duty was clear and choices were simple. Instead, he told him about snow and silence and the 48 hours that taught him more about himself than he'd wanted to know. War asks you to do things that can't be undone, Daniel said. It turns good men into killers and calls it necessary. Maybe it is necessary. I don't know anymore. What I know is that every life you take, even for the right reasons, costs you something, and you never get it back. His son didn't enlist. Daniel never knew if his story was the reason why, and he never asked. Some things were better left unspoken. On clear winter nights, when the temperature dropped and snow began to fall, Daniel would sometimes stand at his workshop window and watch the flakes accumulate in the yard. His right arm would ache in the cold, the damaged nerves sending phantom signals that the doctors said would probably never stop. He'd think about Foy, about the officer falling in the snow, about all the men who died so that other men could live. He'd think about the child who ran into the square and wonder if she survived the war, if she remembered the day a German officer saved her life hours before an American sniper took his. He never found out. Some questions didn't have answers. You just had to live with not knowing, same as you lived with everything else the war had left behind. The memories, the pain, the knowledge that you were capable of things you'd never imagined, both terrible and necessary, and that the line between the two was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Daniel Joseph Carver died in 1987, 63 years old, in the same town where he was born. His father had been gone for 15 years by then. At the funeral, his son found the Bronze Star in the drawer where it had been since 1945. He wanted to have it displayed with the coffin, but Daniel's wife said no. He carried that weight long enough, she said. Let him rest now. They buried him on a Tuesday in December. The temperature was 14 degrees. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight. The minister read from Matthew, something about the merciful inheriting the earth, and Daniel's son stood by the grave and wondered if his father had ever felt at peace with what he'd done in those woods outside Foy. He'd never know. His father had taken that answer with him, along with everything else he'd carried from the war. But on cold winter nights, when snow fell across northern Michigan and the wind moved through the bare trees like something searching, Daniel's son would sometimes think he understood. That courage wasn't about fearlessness or certainty. It was about doing what you believed was right, even when everything inside you screamed that it was wrong. It was about carrying impossible weights and never asking for credit. It was about living with the consequences of your choices and not looking away from what they'd cost. That was the real story of those 48 hours in the snow. Not the shot that ended the battle, but the man who made it and somehow found a way to keep living afterward. That was the harder victory, the one that didn't come with medals or recognition, just the quiet dignity of enduring what couldn't be changed and trying every single day to be a little bit better than the war had made you. The snow kept falling. It always did. And somewhere beneath it, in frozen earth that had witnessed too much suffering, the weight of it all remained, waiting, patient, unmoved by time or justification or the stories people told themselves about necessary evils, just there, forever there. Like the memory of a single shot that saved lives and took one, that was both right and wrong, that no amount of years could ever fully reconcile. That was war, and that was what it asked of men who were too young to understand what they were agreeing to, but who carried the burden anyway because someone had to. Because the alternative was worse. Because love sometimes meant killing, and duty sometimes meant breaking your own heart, and courage sometimes looked like a man lying in frozen earth for 48 hours, waiting for a shot he didn't want to take, but knew he must. Daniel had made that shot. Then he'd spent 42 years trying to live with it. In the end, maybe that was the real act of valor. Not the killing, but the living. Not the moment of action, but the decades of aftermath. Not the shot that ended the battle, but the quiet, private war that came after, fought in silence and solitude, with no medals and no recognition, just the daily choice to keep going despite everything. And on winter nights when the snow fell and the temperature dropped to 14 degrees, you could almost hear it if you listened carefully enough. The sound of a man breathing in frozen darkness, waiting for a moment that would define him. The sound of doubt and duty colliding. The sound of a trigger being pulled, and a life being taken, and a soul being changed forever. The sound of war. The real one. Not the one in history books or memorial speeches, but the one that happened inside men's hearts and stayed there long after the fighting stopped. That sound never really ended. It just got quieter, easier to ignore, but it was always there, underneath everything else, waiting in the cold and the silence, waiting like Daniel had waited, patient and unmerciful and true.